It was one of those nights where the whole world felt like it had been draped in black velvet, quiet as a grave. Not a breeze stirred the tall prairie grass, and even the crickets seemed to be holding their breath. The widowed rancher, Jake, was sprawled out on his sagging mattress, boots kicked off, one hand resting on his belly, half dreaming and half dreading the dawn he knew would come too soon. He'd been alone for longer than he cared to remember. Just him, the ranch, and a silence that pressed against his ribs like a winter wind. Then came the knock. Soft at first, like someone was shy to make a sound, but it cut through the quiet like a blade through rope. Jake's eyes shot open. Midnight. Who in God's name would be at his door at midnight? Ranch hands were gone for the night, neighbors slept, and outlaws. Well, outlaws weren't exactly knocking. They were more the shoot-first type. He swung his legs off the bed, boots thumping against the wooden floor. His hand hovered near the pistol on the knitstand, heart hammering. Another knock. Louder this time. Hesitation tangled with curiosity. He muttered under his breath, "Shoot? What now?" and stumbled toward the door. When he opened it, he didn't see a man or some drunk wandering fool. He saw a little girl, barefoot, her dress torn and dirty, eyes huge and scared, like she'd been carrying a whole world on her tiny shoulders. Her hair was tangled, strands sticking to her tear-streaked cheeks. She looked up at him and whispered, barely audible over the pounding of his own heart, "Mama. Needs help." That's all it took. Just that small, broken whisper. Jake's chest tightened, memories clawing at him. He'd lost his own woman, hadn't held anyone close in years. And here was this little thing, small as a twig, looking at him like he was her only hope. He swallowed hard, trying not to let the lump in his throat choke him. "Come on," he said, his voice rough and low like gravel rolling in a tin cup. "Lead the way." The girl nodded, relief washing over her face in a blink. She turned, tiny feet padding over the porch boards, and Jake followed, lantern in hand. The air was cold, biting at his cheeks, but he barely noticed. Every step felt like walking into a story he'd never thought he'd be part of again. There was danger out here, sure. Coyotes, loose horses, maybe even some desperado fool who'd wander across the prairie for a thrill. But none of that mattered. Nothing mattered except that small voice, trembling and raw. Pulling him into the dark. As they moved, he started lighting the first lantern on the porch. Then another by the barn door, its golden glow spilling out into the yard. He wasn't sure if it was for him, so he could see the path, or for her, to know she wasn't stepping into the unknown alone. Each light he struck seemed to push back the night, bit by bit. Until the shadows weren't quite so hungry, the girl didn't speak much. Just kept looking over her shoulder, eyes wide and alert, like the darkness itself might pounce at any moment. Jake kept his hand steady on the lantern, steady on the pistol tucked at his hip, steady on the thought that he couldn't let anything happen to her. Not again. He'd failed before, lost too much, but tonight he was going to make sure someone survived. By the time they reached the edge of the property, where the tall grass met the old creek bed, the ranch was lit up like a little beacon in the wilderness. The lantern swayed gently in the night wind, casting long, flickering shadows. And Jake felt something stir deep in his chest, a mix of dread and something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. The little girl glanced up at him again, eyes glistening. "Mama's over here," she said, voice trembling, pulling him forward. Jake nodded, taking a deep breath, feeling the weight of the night settle on his shoulders. He didn't know what he'd find, didn't know if he was walking toward danger or salvation. But one thing was for sure, whatever happened next, he wasn't turning back. Not tonight. Not with that little girl depending on him, and with that, the rancher stepped fully into the dark. Lantern swinging at his side, heart pounding like a drum. ready to face whatever the midnight held. Asterisk by the time Jake and the little girl reached the edge of the property, the ranch was draped in shadows, the kind that felt thick enough to chew. But Jake wasn't about to let that darkness boss him around. He grabbed a lantern off the porch railing and shook it, the glass clinking like tiny bells. He struck a match, watched the flame hiss to life, and felt that little spark chase some of the fear from his chest. One by one, he started hanging lanterns across the property fence posts, barn doors, the old water trough, even the hitching post out by the corral. Each lantern sent golden light spilling into the night, cutting through the black like a knife. The little girl watched him with wide eyes, holding on to her tiny bundle of courage. "Why? Why so many lights?" she asked, her voice quivering like a leaf in the wind. Jake shrugged, but there was a smile creeping under his worn-out beard. "Ain't just about seeing, kid. It's about letting folks know something's up. If you gotta signal help, might as well do it right." She nodded slowly, gripping his hand like he was her anchor. They moved on, boots crunching against the cold dirt, wind tugging at their coats. The path they followed was a trail barely wider than a horse could fit through, and the dark around it felt alive, whispering secrets Jake didn't want to hear. Wolves? Could be. Some drunk outlaw wandering? Might be. But he kept his jaw tight, eyes sharp, lantern swinging, keeping that little girl close. Every now and then, he'd glance back at the ranch. The lanterns flickered in the darkness, shadows dancing across the old barn and corrals. The sight warmed him in a way he hadn't felt in years. Ain't just light, it was a warning. A promise. A sign that he hadn't given up yet. As they walked, he noticed how the girl's steps slowed whenever the ground got rough or the shadows grew thick. "You hung in tough?" he asked, trying to keep his voice easy, but there was steel in it. She nodded, brushing a strand of hair from her dirt-smeared face. I gotta. Mama needs me." Jake's chest tightened again. Same reason he'd thrown himself into work after his wife died. Keep moving, keep surviving. Ain't no crying in the dark, ain't no letting fear take the reins. And that little girl had more fight in her than most grown folks he'd met. He found himself respecting her grit. The trail led them down to a dried-up creek bed, the kind of place folks avoided at night unless they had no other choice. Trees leaned in over the path, branches scraping like old fingers against their coats. Jake kept swinging the lantern ahead, chasing the black back, creating a little circle of safety around them. He felt a rush of adrenaline, worry, something raw he hadn't felt in a long time. "You ready for this?" he muttered, more to himself than the girl. She just nodded, teeth chattering, eyes wide and fierce. Jake knew then this wasn't just a rescue. It was a test. A pull from the universe to see if he'd let himself care again. To see if he'd face what he'd been running from, fear, loss, and the memory of nights too dark to stand alone. Then he heard it, a faint groan, soft and ragged, carried by the wind. The girl stiffened. "Mama," she whispered, almost scared to say it loud. Jake's grip on the lantern tightened. That sound was real, and it was close. He motioned for her to stay behind him, eyes scanning the underbrush. The shadows shifted, the lantern light catching on shapes that made his gut tighten. But he didn't falter. Not now. Not with this kid counting on him. He knew the ranch lights had done their job. Folks nearby might wake, might come out to see the flicker on the horizon. And that was fine. Ain't nobody should ever face a night like this alone if they could help it. The lanterns weren't just glowing for show, they were calling for life to step in. Calling for hope to find its way through the dark. With each step closer to the source of the groan, Jake felt that old fire flicker in his chest. Fear, sure, but mixed with that stubborn grit that had kept him alive through long winters, busted fences, and lonely nights. He realized this was more than a rescue mission. It was a reminder that even in the blackest hours, light could come from the smallest flicker, from the simplest choice to keep moving, to keep helping. And as he took the next step, lantern swinging, little girl clutching his coat, he swore under his breath, "We're getting her out of this. Night don't get the last word." The closer they got to the creek bed, the heavier the night air felt. It was like the darkness was thick enough to hold, pressing down on Jake's shoulders and making each breath taste of dirt and worry. The little girl, clutching his coat like it was a lifeline, was quieter now, her small body trembling from a mix of cold, fear, and exhaustion. Jake could hear her tiny, uneven breaths, and it hit him hard. Ain't nobody should be out here like this, not alone, not scared, not hurt. Then they saw her, just lying there, tangled in brush, one leg bent wrong, the other stretched awkward. Her face was streaked with blood and grime, hair matted against her cheeks. She groaned low, barely conscious, eyes fluttering as she tried to move. Jake didn't waste a second. He dropped to his knees, lantern swinging low so he could see. "Ma'am," he said, voice steady calm, like he was talking to someone who needed him to be a rock. "I got you. We're getting you out of here." She tried to speak, voice weak and broken. "Chores." "Through me," she managed, lips quivering. Jake cursed under his breath. Typical creekbed accident, horses spooked in the dark, people fall, bones break, panic sets in. But it didn't matter. What mattered was getting her alive. He grabbed the first aid kit from his saddlebag, tossing it onto the ground. The girl ran her small fingers over her mama's face, whispering, "Hold on, Mama. Hold on." And Jake felt that lump in his throat tighten like a fist. He worked fast. Bandages, cleaning cuts, securing sprains, keeping the woman talking, keeping her awake. "You hear me?" He barked, a little rough but firm. "I ain't letting you fade on me. You hear me?" She nodded weakly, a flicker of fight in her eyes. That fire, that stubborn fire reminded him of why he hadn't quit on life. Ain't nobody worth saving if you don't fight like hell. The girl sat on the ground beside them, holding her mama's hand, murmuring little reassurances that sounded bigger than her size. Jake felt the weight of responsibility settle deep in his chest. He'd been alone a long time, but now he had 2 lives depending on him, and he couldn't fail. Couldn't, not this time. He glanced around the creek bed. Dark shadows clawed at the edges, the night wind rattling through the trees like whispers from old ghosts. Every sound made him tense, twigs snapping, water dripping somewhere upstream, but he pushed the panic aside. Ain't no place for fear right now. Not when someone's life is hanging by a thread. Finally, after what felt like hours but was really only minutes, he got her semi-stable enough to move. "We're taking her back," he said, glancing at the girl, who nodded fiercely, wrapping her arms around her mama as best she could. Jake lifted the woman carefully, half carry, half drag, feeling every pound, every flinch, every groan. The trail back to the ranch felt longer than the trip out. Every step was a fight against fatigue, against the wind, against the creeping dark that wanted to swallow them whole. But Jake kept moving, lantern swinging, eyes sharp. He kept talking to her, telling her she was going to be all right, telling her to hang on, telling the girl to stay strong too. Words matter when fear's gnawing at your bones. Finally, the first light of the lanterns from the ranch caught their eyes. The glow hit the creek bed like a promise, like a soft hand pulling them toward safety. The woman's eyes flickered with recognition, and Jake felt relief like a hammer in his chest. They were gonna make it. Just barely, but they were gonna make it. When they got her onto the porch, Jake eased her down, the little girl leaning against her mama like she'd never let go. The rancher stayed on his knees for a beat, catching his breath, letting the adrenaline fade just enough for the weight of what he'd done to settle in. Ain't no medal for saving someone's life out here, but the satisfaction, the quiet pride, it hit harder than any gold ever could. He looked at the girl. Y'all did good. Real good. You held tight, didn't you? She nodded, eyes shining with tears and relief. Jake allowed a small smile to creep across his weathered face. This night, this wild, dark night, had already done more than scare him. It had reminded him he wasn't dead inside, that even after all the loss, the loneliness, the quiet heartbreak, he could still matter to someone, could still be a hero, even in the middle of nowhere. And for the first time in years, as the woman rested in a corner by the lantern light and the girl curled up beside her, Jake felt the ranch, the night, and himself all a little bit warmer. Ain't nothing perfect, but sometimes that's enough. Asterisk, the wind had picked up by the time Jake got the woman and her daughter back to the porch. Lanterns swayed like crazy, casting jittery shadows across the old barn, corral, and the dirt yard. That soft calm of earlier had been ripped away by the night, replaced with this gnawing, restless howl of the storm coming in. Clouds rolled in fast, thick and black, ready to drench the prairie in sheets of rain. Lightning flickered somewhere far off, and the little girl squeaked. Hugging her mama tight like she was the only solid thing left in the world, Jake took a deep breath. Chest tight, heart hammering like a drum in a honky-tonk. He'd faced storms before, hell. He'd lived through winters that'd freeze a horse in its tracks, but there was something different about tonight. This storm? It wasn't just rain. It was old memories, old pain, and the weight of years spent alone slapping him right in the face. He glanced at the woman resting on the porch steps, bandages clumsily done but holding. She was breathing heavy, pale, eyes flicking toward him like she could see the whole damn story of his life written in his face. And then there was the little girl, cheek pressed against her mama's arm, eyes wide and shining, whispering things like, "Mama'll be okay." Jake shook off the feeling gnawing at him. Can't let it get to me now, he thought. Not tonight. Not when they're counting on me. He went back inside, grabbed blankets, old coats, and whatever he could find to make them warm. Every step he took was a fight against memory. The nights when he'd come home from the ranch, hoping she'd still be there, only to find the bed cold and empty. The nights he'd walk these same steps alone, wishing for a hand to hold or a laugh to break the quiet. Those memories were sharp, like broken glass. But tonight he had a chance to do it right. Chance to save someone, chance to fight back against the darkness that had been trying to swallow him for years. And he grabbed it, hands rough and steady, throwing blankets over the woman and girl, making a little nest by the fire. The wind rattled the windows, shook the boards of the porch, and Jake caught himself flinching. Ain't no hiding it, fear had snuck back in. He cursed softly, muttered under his breath, "Get a grip, Jake. Ain't gonna let it win tonight." He poured coffee into tin cups, the steam rising like little ghosts. Sat down on the step beside the girl, who clutched her mama's hand with all the strength her tiny body could muster. The woman looked at him, weak smile cracking her face. "Thank you," she whispered. "Not the kind of thank you that comes easy, but the kind that comes straight from your guts." Jake nodded, keeping his own emotions in check. Ain't nothing. Just doing what anyone should. But inside, a fire was sparking. Something he hadn't felt in a long time. Purpose, drive, maybe even hope. The storm hit then, full force. Rain hammered the roof. Lightning lit the sky in jagged slices. Thunder rolling like the old drums of battle he hadn't faced in years. But inside, by the glow of the lanterns and firelight, there was calm. Not quiet, not easy, but real. Life was messy, dangerous, loud, and right here. He was exactly where he needed to be. Neighbors had started showing up, drawn by the light and the chaos, and Jake realized something else. He hadn't been as alone as he thought. Ain't no man's life meant to be completely solitary. There were always folks watching, always folks willing to step up if you liked the signal. He gave a nod here, a grunt there, accepting their help without shame. They brought extra blankets, helped patch up the barn doors so the rain wouldn't ruin the hay, offered warm hands and quiet reassurances. Through it all, Jake felt a shift inside. That old pain, the nights of silence, the grief that had felt endless was still there, sure. But it didn't feel crushing anymore. It felt like fuel. Like fire he could use to keep moving, to keep protecting, to keep living. For the first time in years, he felt alive in a way that wasn't just about surviving. The little girl yawned, head resting against her mama, eyes half shut, finally trusting that someone bigger and stronger was holding the world together just enough to get them through the storm. Jake leaned back on the porch, shoulders tired but steady, watching the rain pour down. Lanterns swayed, shadows danced, but he didn't flinch. Ain't no darkness big enough to scare him when he's got fire inside. People depending on him, and a reason to fight. And that night, as lightning split the sky and thunder shook the prairie, Jake realized something he hadn't in a long time. Sometimes old pain can light a new fire. Sometimes the dark isn't something to hide from, it's something to stand in. Lantern swinging, heart beating, ready to face it head on. The first light of dawn hit the prairie slow and gold, like it was sneaking in just to see if anybody was still standing. Jake woke before the sun fully showed its face, boots creaking as he stepped onto the porch. The storm had passed, leaving the ranch smelling fresh and earthy, wet dirt and hay blending into that familiar ranch life perfume. Lanterns swayed gently in the breeze, their glow soft now. Barely holding on to the last hints of night, he glanced inside the cabin. The woman was dozing in a chair, wrapped in blankets, bandages holding steady. Her chest rose and fell easy now, no more groans, no more sharp gasps of pain. The little girl had curled up on the floor beside her mama, head resting on her lap, arms clutching tight like they'd never let go. Jake paused at the doorway, heart tight but warm. Ain't nothing like seeing folks safe after a night like yesterday. Coffee boiled on the stove, filling the cabin with that familiar morning smell, the kind that made you feel alive before the sun even peeked over the horizon. Jake poured a cup, black as midnight, no sugar, no cream, just bitter and real. He sipped slow, watching the light stretch across the land, touching fences, barn roofs, and the tall grasses that had been hiding in the dark all night. The ranch felt alive again. Real alive. He stepped back outside, boots crunching on wet dirt, lantern swinging lazily in his hand. The little girl joined him, rubbing her eyes, hair messy from sleep. "Did we make it?" she asked, voice still small, still trembling a little. Jake smiled down at her, rough and tired, but genuine. "We sure as hell did, kid. You, me, and your mama. We made it." The woman followed after, slow but steady, leaning on Jake when she needed it. Her eyes caught his, gratitude shining through the pain she'd been through. I don't know how to thank you," she whispered, voice barely audible. Jake waved her off. "Ain't about thanking. Just doing what needed doing. Folks gotta watch out for each other, that's all." They moved about the ranch together, checking horses, letting them graze, gathering tools knocked over in the storm. Jake kept a careful eye on both of them, teaching the little girl how to fetch hay, showing her mama the quickest way to tighten a fence latch. The mundane, everyday chores felt like therapy, like reclaiming life bit by bit. The ranch wasn't just a place to survive anymore. It was a place to live, to heal, to rebuild. By mid-morning, neighbors had started drifting in. Some brought food, some brought extra blankets. A few just came to make sure everyone was all right. Jake nodded and smiled at them all, feeling that old loneliness crack just a little. He realized something important. The ranch didn't have to be lonely. The light from the lanterns hadn't just saved lives last night, it had called folks back. Reminded them he wasn't just some ghost out here. And that community still meant something. The little girl and her mama started laughing softly at a spilled bucket of water, hair wet from the storm and muddy from the ground. Jake chuckled too, leaning against the fence post, watching the scene like a man who'd been asleep for years and just woke up. Ain't nothing fancy about this life, but it's real, it's messy, and it's worth it. He looked at the lantern still hanging, flickering gently in the breeze. He realized he didn't want to take them down. Not tonight, not tomorrow, maybe not ever. They weren't just lights, they were symbols, beacons for anyone lost, anyone needing a safe place to land. The ranch had become that place. The woman walked up beside him, tired but steady. "I don't think I ever realized how much hope can feel like," she said softly. Jake just nodded, tipping his hat back and watching the horizon glow gold and pink. Ain't no easy words for mornings like this. Ain't no quick fix for nights like the one they'd survived. But there was peace now, the kind that hits your chest slow and deep, like a river carving its mark over years. He glanced at the little girl, who waved a sticky hand at him, grinning with sleepy pride. Jake's heart swelled. Ain't nothing small about saving someone, about being there when the night seems too big, too dark. The ranch, the sunrise, the two lives he'd helped protect, they all mattered. He'd learned that last night, and as the sun climbed higher, touching every corner of the ranch, Jake felt it clear as day. The past was gone. The darkness behind them, and the future messy, wild, and full of promise was waiting. The ranch wasn't just a place to survive anymore. It was a place to live, to fight, to love, and to shine. Asterisk days had passed since that wild, stormy night, and the ranch was alive in a way Jake hadn't felt in years. The sun hit the fields early, gold spilling over fences and corrals, and the air smelled of fresh hay, wet earth, and promise. The lanterns he'd hung during that long dark night still swayed gently in the breeze, flickering like tiny guardians watching over the land. He hadn't taken a single one down. Couldn't bring himself to. They were more than lights. They were reminders. The woman and her little girl had settled in, helping around the ranch, learning the rhythms of chores and animals and the land. The little girl had a laugh now, loud and honest, bouncing off barn walls, echoing down the paths Jake had walked alone for too long. And her mama, strong but still tender from the accident, was slowly regaining her stride, helping with horses, fixing fences, even showing Jake a thing or two he'd forgotten. Jake watched them one morning, leaning on a fence post, coffee in hand, hat tipped low against the sun. The wind tugged at his coat, birds called overhead, and for the first time since losing his wife, he felt a deep, steady kind of peace. Ain't the kind of peace that comes from quiet or loneliness. This was the kind that comes from living, from being needed, from realizing you're not just surviving anymore. The little girl ran past him, waving a hand with a grin that made dirt streak her cheeks. "Come on, Papa Jake," she yelled. He chuckled, shaking his head, letting her run ahead. Ain't nobody told her to call him that, but he didn't mind. It stuck. Felt right. Her mama caught up a few moments later, wiping hands on her apron, smiling tired but real. "I still can't believe we made it through that night," she said. Her eyes met his, and he felt something shift deep inside, something that had been dormant for years. Connection, trust, maybe even the tiniest spark of something more. Ain't no rush to name it, no rush to define it. Just knowing they were safe, that she was safe, was enough for now. Jake walked the property with them, lantern swinging at his side even though the sun was high. Folks in the neighborhood had started noticing the glow still hanging at night, coming by with curious smiles and friendly nods. Some stayed for coffee, some just waved, but all reminded Jake that the world hadn't forgotten him. And he hadn't forgotten it either. Ain't no man built to stand alone forever. That night, he lit the lanterns again, slow and deliberate. Porch, barn, fence posts, every corner that had been dark just a few days ago now shimmered in the gentle glow. The little girl helped, hands small but steady, holding the matches while he lit each one. By the time all the lights were burning, the ranch looked alive. Like a small town in the middle of nowhere, a safe harbor against the dark. They stood there for a moment, watching the flickering flames, wind rustling the grass. Night settling soft over the prairie. The little girl yawned, leaning into her mama's side. "Do they always stay on?" she asked, voice small and curious. Jake looked down at her, a grin tugging at his mouth. "Yeah, kid, they do. 'Cause sometimes folks need a little light, even when it's dark, always." Her mama smiled too, the kind of smile that comes after fear and pain, after nights that seemed endless. A smile that told Jake they trusted him, and he'd earned it. For the first time, the ranch didn't feel like a lonely stretch of land or a place filled with ghosts. It was home. Their home now. He wandered over to the barn, checking on horses, then glanced back at the cabin. Smoke drifted lazily from the chimney, the sounds of laughter and chatter spilling out the door. The storm, the darkness, the fear, they were all behind them. All that mattered was this life, messy and beautiful and real. And Jake knew one thing clear as the prairie sky. The lights weren't going anywhere. They were a symbol, a promise, that no matter how dark the night got, no matter how wild the storms, the ranch would always be a place where folks could find safety, warmth, and hope. Ain't just about lanterns either. It was about hearts. People leaning on each other, holding steady, keeping the fire alive. As he stood there, lantern in hand, wind brushing against his face, Jake felt the full weight of it all, the loss, the pain, the lonely years, but also the power of what he'd gained. A family, a purpose, a second chance. The lights flickered soft, golden against the horizon, and he let himself smile, honest and full. The night would come again, storms too, darkness lurking on the edges of the prairie. But now Jake knew he wasn't facing it alone. And the ranch? It wasn't just a patch of land or a lonely homestead anymore. It was alive, full of life, and glowing steady in the heart of the wild. He tipped his hat back, lantern swinging, and whispered to himself, half for the wind, half for the stars. "Yeah, we're home."